Okay, so thank you for the opportunity, and thanks so much for organizing and for the kind words and for the previous talks. So as I'm going to talk about the sort of diagrammatic nature of Schelling's thought, and in order to sort of say why to do that, because Schelling's work has some diagrams in it, some schemas, but it's not full of them. And so the question is, what does it mean to say his thought is diagrammatic? And so the first caveat is to say that I don't subscribe to this reading of Schelling, which is still quite common, that he couldn't make up his mind and change systems, because he kept failing. I think Schelling saw systems as things you made and then broke and then moved on. And I think even when he was in his 20s, he said this explicitly. He said, nothing would sadden the philosopher more than to become a tool of their own system if they finished it. Right? So I think for Schelling, systems are a thing you try out. And so I think this says a lot in terms of the diagrammatic. And then, it's also evident in Schelling that he writes in terms of outlines, exhibitions, presentations. He kind of has this constructive attitude. And I think this constructiveness is what's diagrammatic about his thought. So we can say that diagrammatic means basically that it's a exposition, or it's a creation that shows the work, right? It shows the work into making it, that went into creating this act or making this thought, and that it's not closed, right? So I think this would be the sort of very vague notion of the diagrammatic. And I mean, of course, I'll hopefully explain that more. This also connects to what is also, I think, consistent throughout Schelling's work, again, from the 1790s until the 1840s. This notion of the potencies and the Potenslehre in Schelling is that nature, in its broadest sense, is composed of a set, a sort of unclosed, unbound set of these augmentative, self-augmentative powers. And of course, he often expresses this algebraically, like in the following way. And as Mary-Louise Heuser-Kessler and others have pointed out, he had quite an interest in mathematics, and this notion of the exponent as being a kind of diagrammatic space-forming form of mathematics was actually very important to Schelling, despite the fact that he's seen as kind of not allied so strongly to math. So again, this can also be seen again as Heuser-Kessler and others have pointed out, and as Châtelet points out, who I'll talk about later. This is also evident in the physics and field physics that were influenced by Schelling. Again, this is a diagram from Maxwell by way of Faraday, right? The idea that, how do you exhibit, how do you construct fields, right? You diagram them, right? So the diagrams show what they are. They're a sign of what they are, but they're less than a sign because they show the work, they show the movement, right? It's not just a symbol, it's a moving symbol. And, this diagrammatic notion that's very important. And so to sort of ground or to sort of stick with a particular example in order to go through Schelling's work, I want to talk specifically about organic movement and how Schelling uses this diagrammatic way of thinking to talk about dimensionality and to talk about the movement of animals. Of course, these are two images from Da Vinci's manuscript on dynamic soaring in the flights of birds. The point being that when Schelling talks about animal movement, which he does early on, and then he returns to it in the Darstellung lectures in Berlin, the idea is, of course, not to just talk about how animals move in terms of their bodies, but the movements they're capable of and how the movements of which they're capable of shows their real potentiality. Right? So again, this is again thinking in terms of this self-augmentative way, right? This algebraic exponential way of thinking movement, right? Not just as a totally free act, but as conditioned by the body, but also exceeding the body in some sense. And so, and this, for instance, is a chronophotograph by Xavi Bao, which is, the flight of birds, repeated at every step, right? To give you an instance of, what is being shown in the diagram, right? It's this momentary capture of movement that doesn't completely stifle it, right? It's to show the capacities of movement in the movement itself. And there's a recent short text, which I'll return to, by Ian Hamilton Grant. It's a preface to a book, which I'll talk about later, where he described this as this ontographic concept in Schelling, right? The fact that beings draw their capacities as they move, right? Their movement is proof of their capacity and the capacity itself. And again, this is evident in Schelling's Darstellung lectures, where he returns to Aristotle, specifically talking about the flight of birds. How do we say birds are conditioned to move only in particular ways, yet they seem free? What does this mean for thinking nature as this unbound dynamic system when it also seems to be self-constraining, right? It seems to sort of inhibit itself. And so how is this expressed in the diagram? Okay, and so there's a couple caveats that have to be addressed, in that the diagrammatic, when it's talked about in contemporary philosophy, or even in modern philosophy in general, further back, is usually attached to philosophies of eminence, right? So of course, Spinoza on the left, or Bergson on the top right, or Deleuze and Guattari's nasty little diagram of Kant on the bottom right. Right? And the idea, of course, is that in philosophies of eminence, the diagram is a way to show motion and structure, right, without breaking out of the sort of monist or the eminent constraint, right? So it's about the sort of to show emergence that is not radically different from which it emerges from, right? So, and of course, Schelling, I think, is not a thinker of eminence. He's critical of Spinoza in this sense, not in other senses. So we have to say, okay, what is different about Schelling? And then the other aspect of modern thought and contemporary thought that is diagrammatic is, of course, the thought that is more explicitly mathematical. So whether it's Peirce, for instance, on the left of the screen, or the pedagogical engagements with mathematical teaching, as in De Freitas and Sinclair. How do gestures emphasize ideas? I'm sorry, I'm going to use my hands a lot, but it's like in this case justified. Or even more radically, this is from Manoni, a woman who's part of this Topos of Music group, right? How you can translate physical structures into music and back again, right? So this is another way the diagrammatic and the gestural are combined, right? In this pedagogical, mathematically emphasized way. This is a pangolin scale turned into jazz, if anyone's curious about that. So the question then is like how, Schelling doesn't seem to fit this general notion of the diagram. And the reason for this, of course, is that Schelling is interested in the transcendental kind of ascending or anabasis, right, of thinking on the one hand, and the sort of descendental catabasis of thought on the other hand. We could say the transcendental up and the naturphilosophical down, to oversimplify. And so this, of course, poses two related problems. And from this point on, the pictures are going to get increasingly silly. So, again, this would be the nugget of the transcendental ascent, right, from Kant. This is from the Opus Posthumum. Of course, it's a famous one. He who would know the world must manufacture it in his own self, or sometimes I think it's mind as translation. Indeed, right? So we sort of have to have a notion of the world in order to even start talking about it. So this would be the ascendant, ascending position, the position from on high. And then I think the naturphilosophical response to this would be good old Carl Sagan. If you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe, right? This is the genetic constraint of naturphilosophy, right? If you want to make something from scratch, you have to know what from scratch means. And this is something that haunts Schelling his whole life, really. What is the beginning of dynamism, right? This is the thing that kind of drives him nuts. This unprethinkable, right, before this, this difficulty. Okay, so in order to address this tension, right, how is he diagrammatic? How does the diagram work between this, transcendental ascent and this descendental naturphilosophy? The sort of fundamental text, which I'll talk about for the rest of the presentation, is the universal deduction, allgemeine Deduktion, or the categories of physics is the sort of subtitle. And so this is just a representative quote, which I'll read, right? And this is one of the most difficult, I think, naturphilosophical texts of Schelling. So he says, magnetism, electricity, and the chemical process are the universal categories of physics. However, it is not clearly shown how then, by means of these and only these three functions, matter may be completed. To conclude in advance, this can be shown only from the relation of these functions to space, and in particular to the dimensions of space. Right, so importantly, in the universal deduction, Schelling says the sole task of natural science is to construct matter. This is how he starts, which is like quite a thud on the table to start that way. And then, the important point and where the diagrammatic comes in is this question of dimensionality, right? The fact that dimensions are the way we human beings can reconstruct the very first steps of the formation of things by powers, right? By different types of activities. And so this is the schema of this relationship between schema, dimensionality, category, and power, right? He sets this up in the universal deduction. And so I'll sort of go through these, how these relate to each other very briefly, and then I'll turn to Guy Châtelet, who kind of takes up this project of Schelling's and expands on it. And I'll introduce who he is later, because he's not so well known. Okay, so to start with the line length and the magnetic then. So how Schelling kind of argues for this is he says that the line, is the sort of most basic understanding of polarity. And so you see immediately how there's a tension in Schelling between the act of drawing and the diagram once it has been drawn. So, we think of the drawing of a line, the measuring of a length, right, is from a point to a point. And he says, this act gives us a notion of length, but to understand it as pointing to a power of nature, to a potency, we should think it in terms of the magnetic, right? So the fact that the line is actually, a segment of polarity, right? So in fact, in our head, we should think that the line is really drawn from the middle out, right? Even though we as, handed beings draw it from left to right or right to left or something like this. He thinks that the line, and as we construct from the line, is really this, snip, right? This the cut of the expansive power of nature. And so from this, he then starts to construct, from the line as length and polarity, we get breadth, as angularity, um, as the possibility of surface and of the current and flow of energy, especially electricity. And this is a famous experiment gone wrong, death by ball lightning. Right? The unpredictability of the electrical is because of the conductivity of surfaces and its ability to move in a way that is different from the magnetic, right? It is the result of polarities gives a breadth of movement for the electrical, right? And then from this, Schelling then says we can then think of the chemical, and he specifically talks about the galvanic in terms of organic bodies, right? Organic bodies as being a sort of enclosure then of the the polarity of lines, the surfaces, right? The skins, the membranes of the electrical, and then finally being enclosed in the chemical, right? In the developmental capacities and movements of the organism, which of course then gives rise to sensibility and these different capacities. So, Schelling kind of, in a sense, he's going from polarity to breadth of surface and movement of current to the enclosure of a body, which of course is not completely enclosed, but takes in all these tensions and is still open to them, by way of our physiology to the world outside. And, at this point, Schelling then issues a big caveat, a big warning, which he comes back to at the end of the text, at the end of the universal deduction. And this is, he says, look, this construction I've just done from, line to angle to solid, this is what makes sense for us if we want to think the most basic notion of creativity and how it moves through nature. He says it probably didn't really happen in that precise, nice order. He says we can't know. Right, and so this is again this tension between the genetic method of this nature philosophical construction and this constant transcendental overview that keeps coming in. Right, so we have to be aware of the fact that we are just somewhat fancy monkeys trying to reconstruct all of nature, right, according to our formalisms of which we have access because of our physiology. So this is why the diagrammatic, and this is the sort of cautiousness of Schelling, which again I don't think is indecision, but this things being constantly at work as an attempt to have a formalism that is constantly sort of waving its hands and saying this is not a closed and finished thing. And this is why he warns about we can see nature as petrified intelligence, right? This phrase that Hegel will make more famous. He says this at the end of the universal deduction, right? We have to be wary of the fact that we can treat all of nature as food for our brain, but it's not only that. And if we think it's only that, we get into trouble. Okay, and the issue there is, of course, this question of reactivation, right? So as soon as we think we have understood nature from the transcendental perspective, we have to reactivate, or we have to resubmit the very capacity to see nature that way to nature itself, right? We have to naturalize our supposedly on high perspective. And this is where Châtelet, Guy Châtelet, is very important. And just to introduce him, because he's not really well known. He was contemporary of Deleuze. He's a philosopher of science in a very strange way. Charles Aluni, who I think I saw in the attendees list, called him the last romantic, and I think this is very true, because he was a mathematician, philosopher, physicist who dabbled in economics, and he was a prominent member of the homosexual front in Paris, until the 90s, and wrote these political tracts against neoliberalism, who was a very interesting figure. But he's one of also, on top of all of this, one of the best readers of Schelling, I think, in the 20th century, especially of the Natur philosophy. I think he's, yeah, really one of the best. And this is a collection that hopefully will come out in the next few months that I translated with a bunch of other people. He's very hard to translate. So the sort of fundamental aspect of Châtelet in terms of Schelling is this notion of Châtelet sees a progression in the thought from intuitions to gestures to diagrams to signs. And so this is the sort of, on the screen, this is the sort of gesture, diagram, sign. You know, it's a kind of progression, but it can go back and forth. It's not like a teleology. And so the idea is that, you know, scientists and philosophers have intuitions, which they sort of gesture or try to embody. And then they diagram them. And the diagram captures the gesture mid-flight, as Châtelet puts it. And then these are hardened or frozen into signs, mathematical symbols or words. And so this progression of the kind of experimenter, whether it's philosophical or scientific, gives thought this kind of unbound but yet constrained attitude that he sees in Schelling. And so this is just a repetition of what I had up earlier, but then Châtelet adds this caveat. Right, he adds this question of fields to sort of press even harder the diagrammatic character of Schelling's thought. So all these line up, and then they in turn line up with vector, scalar, and tensor fields in physics and mathematics, or we can think of them in terms of velocity, temperature, and material stress. So just to kind of go through those and how these relate to the earlier schema of Schelling. Right, vectors, we think of, you know, fluid dynamics, Schelling's whirlpool, you know, the idea that there's movement with a direction, right, and that it's traced in the lines of the movement, right, so the movement is tracing itself, right. A scalar field would be a distribution of intensity, so, you know, heat, this is a, you know, infrared photograph, right, so it's partitioned based on the intensity of, you know, heat and cold, right? So there's a two-step model that's correlated, right? Temperature and visualization of it. And then the sort of tensor field, which again, this would correspond to the solidity of the organism in Schelling, right? You think of this in terms of material stress, right? In terms of how much weight can a bridge hold, how much weight can a muscle take before tearing, what can a bone endure before there's a torsion or a crack, right? So it's a sense of this solidness. So in all these senses, right, forces are at play and they interrelate, but they're talked about, they're diagrammed differently relative to the local conditions, right? So Châtelet kind of expands upon this in Schelling's thought. And he also points out, right, how this reactivates any sense to sort of put human thought as only in the brain. He says, look, what's important to understand is that, you know, this doesn't therefore give us a godlike perspective over everything, but that what it means is that what we take to be free, kind of abstract, our perspective, is really an orientation, right? So the point is that orientation, which is embodied and structured and diagrammatic, conditions even something seemingly as open as our vision, right? And obviously, this is where Schelling kind of goes with this later in his later life, right? This is again going back to the conditions of the body, which channel, you know, the ways in which expression takes place. So of course, you know, animal symmetry, right? Chirality, which, you know, Kant also talked about, of course, in the orientation essay, the Bedeutung essay, right? So different species have different perspectival apparatuses, and this, you know, we can construct this genetically, right? Genetically in the naturphilosophical sense, and this applies to humans as well, right? And the whole point is that, you know, how, you know, abstraction is a seemingly unbound act, yet it is always going to be bound to these conditions and formulations, which we can then find. We sort of have to find them diagrammatically. And we can't address them in another way that really makes sense. They're a condition that allows for an action rather than a complete ground to it or a complete container for it, right? So even human perspective is conditioned in this manner. And this also, we can think about this in terms of the much celebrated uprightness of human beings, and we can unground that through the diagrammatic. So this image on the left is from Thomas Moynihan's Spinal Catastrophism, which is where Ian Grant's preface comes from that I mentioned on ontography, right? We can talk about the head, our uprightness as a great achievement, but really it's just, it's a great causer of back pain and nerve disasters, right? So we can think of our uprightness as sitting on a spine of compressed time, right? Or on the other hand, when we as earthly beings are completely ungrounded and float in space, right? I stole this from Thomas Metzinger. It shows all the horrible things that happen to our bodies when our feet are no longer on the ground. And of course, astronauts can lose their orientation, right, completely. And if you tap yourself on the bottom of your foot, you suddenly know where up is again. And then someone else can walk over to you and smack you on the head, and then you lose it again. Right? So just a sort of example of how flimsy yet how central, this is. And so to return, to the images of Da Vinci, and to return to this notion of, birds as this kind of privileged example of motion and the diagram, going all the way back to Aristotle and to Da Vinci and before, Schelling in the Darstellung der Rationalphilosophie lectures kind of gives Aristotle some shit for saying, you were such a good empiricist, yet when it comes to like the capacity of birds to fly, you kind of quit. You say, well, that's their essence. And Schelling kind of says, that's so un-Aristotle of you, Aristotle, to do that. And this is, again, where the diagrammatic is very important, because, this notion that birds don't fly backwards, right? Fundamentally is like, well, of course, birds, as Aristotle says, of course they can go backwards, but it's through this very elaborate, right, tacking into the wind, soaring down to the water, getting the boost from the thermals, slower, more friction from the wind, then bursting up again, right, as shown in the picture. Just as an example of, this kind of more complex empiricism that is required, in which is necessarily diagrammatic. It's not right before your eyes in the sense of completed objects and movements, but it's about seeing the movement itself, making the movement itself empirical. And so this then feeds into a broader discussion of Schelling's legacy, which again, Mary-Louise Heusser-Kessler has talked about, how Schelling plays into this early discussion of self-organization, right? This is a murmuration of starlings, right? The starlings become one giant starling, essentially, right? This notion of self-organization and self-production, right, obviously has consequences which are harder and harder to see in the material conditions of the species or the organism, but that really requires looking further and further out in terms of the potencies and powers at work, right, all around, right? So this is, I would say, even far beyond the kind of animal studies we're used to reading about in Uxkul or ethology, right? This is a much more physics and much more dynamic oriented notion, I would say. And the other sort of consequence of this, which is again very important for Schelling in the diagram and for Châtelet, is, of course, we can extract from this very complex notion of techniques and technology. So again, Da Vinci's attempts at the helicopter or the wing. On the one hand, all the way, this is one of the first early attempts at what's called deep homology, right? This side-by-side comparison of functional capacities as well as historical homologies, right? How things evolved in a similar way. And of course, this has a long history that is very naturphilosophically oriented in Germany and France. And so hopefully this kind of shows, the kind of work, this auto exhibition that the diagram does. And then I'll just end with this quote from Châtelet. And of course, I have to share this slide. That's him in the middle there, becoming bird in Rio de Janeiro. So this is the concluding paragraph from his book, his Enjeux d'Automobile, which quotes from Schelling's Clara, which people might recognize. So he writes, Châtelet writes, gestures and diagrams illustrate the urgency of an authentic way of conceiving information which would not be committed solely to communication, but would allow a rational grasp of the learning, so the learning of learning. The latter, of course, would be far removed from the neuronal barbarism which exhausts itself in hunting down the recipient of the thought and, well, I won't read the whole thing. I'll just read the last part. It's not this informational pillaging. And then he ends it by saying, Schelling perhaps saw this more clearly. He knew that thought was not always encapsulated within the brain, that it could be everywhere outside in the morning dew. Of course, this is a reference to the Clara, who she says, she sees nature herself in the sadness of the flowers, And so, I think just to conclude, this isn't a panpsychist call, I don't think. I think it's to say that we have to, wherever we look, we're going to find the traces of the powers at work in nature, even in our own mind, even when we think our mind has captured something. What we think we have captured has actually captured us. And in that sense, I'll then end with a little present from Jenny Holzer, which is a nice thing to keep in mind. Thank you.